I heard this story about 5 years ago from a man who had gone hunting with a friend along the Omolon River. They planned to spend a week there. At least that was the idea at first. After that, they would see how things went. By prior arrangement with a local company, a helicopter dropped them off in the upper reaches of the river, right in the middle of the wilderness. They were unloaded with all their gear and the catamaran they planned to use to drift downstream along the Omolon, all the way to a base settlement. Following the river would mean traveling several hundred kilometers. They started their journey in August. In the harsh land of Chukotka, that's probably the most comfortable time of year. But unfortunately, the weather turned against them. Rain poured endlessly, and a brutal wind whipped up waves so rough that the river journey became more misery than adventure. Because of that, they covered barely half the distance they had planned each day. To make matters worse, Vasily, my acquaintance's companion, accidentally dropped his friend's shotgun into the deep river. That incident sparked an argument. In the middle of the taiga wilderness, arguments rarely end well. The two men, once close friends, fought so badly that they split up. Vasily took a double-barreled shotgun and his backpack and continued on foot along the riverbank. My acquaintance stayed with the catamaran and kept drifting downstream. Before separating, they agreed on something important. When my acquaintance reached the base settlement, he would send a helicopter to pick Vasily up at a hunting cabin located about 200 kilometers farther downriver. My acquaintance completed the river trip without any major trouble. But when the helicopter flew to the cabin to pick up Vasily, he wasn't there. They started to worry. 3 days later, they flew out again. This time they saw smoke rising from a campfire. Vasily was alive. But he definitely wasn't well. A deep wound in the palm of his right hand had become infected, and across his chest was a long, raw scrape that itched so badly he kept scratching it constantly. After 10 days of wandering through the wilderness, all the anger between the two friends had faded. Vasily told him everything that had happened. After they separated, Vasily simply followed the riverbank. Along the way, he shot the occasional duck or partridge. In the evenings, he caught fish, mostly grayling, so he never went hungry. The weather gradually improved as well. Only the mosquitoes ruined the peace. There were so many that he constantly wore a mosquito net over his face, and even repellent barely helped. After about a week, his path was blocked by a massive swamp that stretched all the way to the river. To get around it, Vasily had to leave the river and head several kilometers inland. In that unfamiliar mountainous terrain, he lost his way. At first, he didn't even realize it. By the time he understood something was wrong, he had wandered nearly 10 kilometers away from the river. The white northern nights were already fading. By evening, it had grown dark. He needed to set up camp, but the rain kept pushing him forward, forcing him to search for some kind of shelter. And then he saw something. At the base of a mountain slope stood a strange, dome-shaped structure. Vasily had never been to these lands before. He had never seen a yaranga, the traditional dwelling of northern nomadic peoples. In the dim light, he first mistook it for a huge boulder. But as he approached, he realized it was man-made, a shelter, though clearly long abandoned. Tall grass had grown thick around the entrance. It took him a while to even find the doorway. In the darkness, he walked back and forth along the structure until he finally pulled aside a worn reindeer hide and saw a dark opening behind it. Escaping the strengthening rain, he stepped inside and froze. The inside of the yaranga was pitch black. He rummaged through his backpack, pulled out a flashlight, and clicked it on. In that instant, the hair on his head stood straight up. Right in front of him, no more than an arm's length away, the beam illuminated a human face, or something that had once been a face. Dry brown skin stretched tightly across a skull. Sunken eyelids covered hollow eye sockets. A half-open mouth revealed crooked teeth. Long grey hair spilled over the shoulders beneath a strange fur hat. A moment later, Vasily realized what he was looking at. The owner of the dwelling had been dead for a very long time. The body had completely mummified. The mummy sat cross-legged in a yogic pose directly opposite the entrance, facing anyone who walked inside. Slowly recovering from the shock, Vasily examined the dried corpse more closely. Judging by the clothing, it had probably been a woman. Her leather garments were decorated with numerous small carvings made from bone and wood. Some resembled animals. Others were impossible to identify. The skeletal fingers of both hands clutched a darkened shamanic drum resting on her lap. At her belt hung a crude knife, carved from what looked like a piece of deer antler or bone. There was no way Vasily planned to sleep in the same shelter as that thing. Trying to overcome his fear and disgust, he kicked the mummy, hoping to knock it over and drag it outside. It didn't move. He kicked it harder. Nothing. The body felt as solid as stone. Then he grabbed the hem of its clothing with both hands and pulled. Fabric tore. The drum fell to the ground with a dull thud. But the corpse remained sitting upright, like a statue. At that point, Vasily felt genuinely uneasy. Cursing under his breath, he gave up trying to move it, and instead began exploring the interior, looking for a place to sleep. Whether he liked it or not, he would have to spend the night under the same roof as this unpleasant, old woman. Near the wall opposite the entrance were two small sleeping alcoves covered with hides. But when he lifted one of the skins, a horrible smell of rot poured out. He immediately abandoned that idea. In the end, he set up near a fire pit not far from the entrance. He lit a fire using a neatly stacked pile of dry branches that must have been left there by the former inhabitants. Pulling back the hide covering the doorway slightly to let the smoke escape, he warmed up. He hung his soaked clothes to dry, ate a quick meal, and lay down beside the fire. By then, the silent old grandmother sitting nearby didn't bother him as much. Humans can get used to almost anything, especially when they're exhausted. Lying by the crackling fire, wondering who the mummy had been and why animals or insects had never touched it, Vasily fell asleep. He slept for a long time. When he opened his eyes, sunlight was already streaming through the entrance. He stretched lazily, about to stand up. Then a sudden realization sent ice through his body. Where was the old woman? The mummy that he couldn't move the night before was gone. Vasily jumped to his feet and frantically scanned the dark interior with his flashlight. The body had disappeared. there were no clues. He rushed outside and looked around in near panic. Nothing. Even the drum that had rolled away the night before was gone. It was as if the old woman had never existed. Maybe exhaustion had caused him to hallucinate. Shaken and confused, Vasily quickly packed his things and hurried away from the strange place. But something strange happened. By evening, after wandering all day through mountains and dense forest, he suddenly found himself back at the exact same place. The same yaranga. He had somehow made a huge circle. The last thing he wanted was to enter that place again. What if the horrible old Chukchi woman was waiting inside? But the rain had started again, and there was nowhere else to hide. Gathering his courage, he pushed aside the hide covering the entrance. The yaranga was empty. No mummy. Relieved, he lit another fire, ate dinner, and curled up near the hearth. But the night was restless. Several times he woke to strange sounds outside. Sometimes it sounded like murmuring, sometimes like howling, and occasionally there was a deep, rhythmic thumping, like someone beating a drum. Meanwhile, the back of his hand itched terribly. He must have scratched it on something during the journey. By morning, he had scratched the skin until it bled. The wound had appeared on the inside of his palm, and it hurt badly. At dawn, unable to bear the pain any longer, Vasily stepped outside and froze. Behind the nearest tree stood the same shaggy mummy. It stared directly at him with empty eye sockets. In its bony fist, it held the handle of the bone knife. The blade was covered in blood. A wave of animal terror swept through him. Acting purely on instinct, Vasily raised his shotgun and fired. Nothing happened. The blast had no effect. Not even the nearby branches moved. It was as if he had fired a blank. Paralyzed with horror, he watched as the shape of the figure slowly blurred and merged with the morning fog. Within seconds, it vanished completely, as if it had dissolved into the air. Vasily no longer understood what was real. He fled from that place in confusion, almost running, barely aware of where he was going. The wound in his hand throbbed unbearably. Then his chest began to ache. First the skin, then deeper and deeper, until the pain felt like it was reaching his heart. Miraculously, he eventually found the river again. A day later, he reached the hunting cabin where the helicopter was supposed to pick him up. But this story does not have a happy ending. The strange infected wound in his chest spread incredibly fast. Within 24 hours, in a hospital in Anadyr, Vasily was dead. Doctors said it was a rare but extremely aggressive case of sepsis. But my acquaintance believed something else entirely. He had visited those lands many times before. He had heard local legends about Chukchi shamans who could enter a death-like state for months, sometimes even years, and later awaken again. Some people also believed those shamans could control time itself, slow it, or speed it up. A local man, after hearing the story, suggested something chilling. The mummy in the abandoned yaranga might have been one of those shamans, and Vasily paid for insulting the shaman's body and dwelling. Most likely, the offended spirit stabbed the unlucky hunter with that ritual bone knife, but with such a distortion in time that the silly never even realized it had happened. Hunters have always been famous for their strange stories. Every seasoned hunter can recall at least a few incidents that seem completely impossible to explain scientifically. I want to share 3 short stories like that. The Fatal Farewell. Back in elementary school, I had a close friend named Vovka. He lived with his mother, stepfather, and several brothers and sisters in a large apartment in the same building as my family. I didn't learn about the tragedy involving his real father until about 4 years after we met. The details were told to me by my own dad. He was also a hunter, though not nearly as obsessed. In the first years of marriage, Vovka's mother tolerated her husband's weekly hunting trips with friends. After all, he always came back loaded with game. There was never a shortage of meat or wild birds at home. But once the family had 3 children, she started hinting more and more often that maybe, instead of wandering the forests every weekend with a bottle of vodka and a shotgun, he should spend time at home with his growing kids, help her in the house, be a father. But try telling that to a passionate hunter, summer or winter, rain or snow. Vovka's father would grab his shotgun and cartridge belt every weekend and disappear into his beloved forests. Then one Friday, as he was packing for another trip, his wife finally snapped. Normally she was quiet and calm, but that evening she exploded into a furious argument. When he walked out the door, she shouted after him in anger, "Fine, then stay there in your forest if you care more about it than about your wife and children." She regretted those words instantly, but once spoken, they couldn't be taken back. With that farewell, he left for a duck hunt. It was the mid-1970s, early autumn. Back then, game was everywhere. By Sunday, the hunters had filled an entire tent with ducks. When they returned from their last trip through the reeds in inflatable boats and started packing up to head home, something unexpected happened. Vovka's father stepped onto the shore and suddenly noticed that his shotgun, still lying in the boat, was slowly sliding toward the bottom. Water sloshed around inside. He leaned forward, grabbed the barrel, and pulled. At that exact moment, the trigger snagged on a rope inside the boat, and the gun was still loaded. The shotgun discharged point blank into his chest. The blast tore his chest apart. He died instantly. That was how my future friend Vovka lost his father at the age of 5. And later, his stepfather became his father's best hunting friend. Lady Luck. The second story happened much later, in the early 1990s, to an acquaintance of mine named Vadik. Vadik was a passionate hunter too. No matter how well his wife fed him, he still looked at the forest the way a wolf looks at the woods. He had a 7-year-old daughter. Before every hunting trip, he would promise to bring her something back: a hare, a grouse, a duck, and he always kept his promises. He never returned empty-handed. His daughter loved seeing him off and waited eagerly for his return. But one day, out of nowhere, she suddenly said, "Daddy, please don't go hunting anymore. Don't kill birds or animals." She looked genuinely frightened. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked. "Why shouldn't I go? The forest is wonderful. When you're a little older, I'll take you with me." But the girl burst into tears. "Don't go, please don't go." Her parents barely managed to calm her down and put her to bed. Early the next morning, around 4, Vadik quietly started getting ready so he wouldn't wake her. He opened the door and stepped toward the exit. Then he heard small bare feet slapping across the floor. His daughter came running. She threw her arms around him and started sobbing hysterically. "Daddy, don't go hunting. Please don't leave." She clung to him desperately. Trying to reassure her, he said, "Don't worry. Today I'll shoot you a beautiful deer. We'll hang the antlers on the wall." That only made her scream harder. "Don't shoot the deer. Don't go to the forest." Outside, his hunting buddies were already waiting in the car. Finally, he managed to gently free himself from her grip and left the house with a heavy heart. They had planned a deer hunt, but nothing went right from the beginning. The forest seemed empty, tracks everywhere, droppings everywhere, but not a single animal in sight. Even the dog couldn't flush anything out. By the second day, they were ready to give up. Then suddenly, they heard the unmistakable barking of the hunting dog. The chase had begun. There were 3 hunters. They rushed toward the sound. Foddick reached the clearing first. In the middle of a small open patch stood 3 deer, a doe, a young fawn, and a large antlered stag. The stag faced the circling dog, lowering his massive antlers and making aggressive lunges. Usually a stag guards several females, but here there was only one. The others must have escaped. Vadek stayed hidden in the bushes and raised his shotgun, carefully aiming at the stag's head so he wouldn't damage the hide. The shot rang out. A minute later, when his companions reached the clearing, they saw a horrifying scene. Vadek's body lay in the grass, covered in blood. Half of his head was gone. His shotgun lay nearby with the bolt completely destroyed. The deer had fled far into the forest. But hunting was the last thing on anyone's mind. He had no chance of surviving. Exactly why the cartridge exploded backward remains unclear. It's extremely rare, but it happens. It seems that day one of the 2 fathers had to die, the human or the stag. And despite humanity's advantage, Lady Luck chose the animal. In the Altai Mountains. The third case happened in 2000 in the Altai region. I heard it from a police operative who was serving in the city of Bisk at the time. A task force had been urgently sent to a remote village to investigate a very confusing incident. A hunter had been shot during a hunt, supposedly by accident. The operative and his partner were sent to assist the local officer. After interviewing the hunters and examining the scene, the story became very strange. According to the shooter, whom we'll call Sergej, here is what happened. He was waiting in an ambush with 3 other hunters, while the dogs drove a herd of wild boars toward them. It was early morning, dark, foggy. Suddenly a terrible scream echoed through the forest. Startled, Sergej saw one of the hunters running straight toward him, without a gun. A second later, something enormous burst out of the fog behind him, moving in huge leaps. His first thought was, a bear. His friend was about to die. Sergej raised his double-barreled shotgun and fired instantly at the huge, hairy shape. The creature roared in pain. He hit it, but it was too late. In a final leap, the beast caught the fleeing hunter, grabbed him with long arms, and lifted him high into the air. The man screamed and kicked helplessly. The creature stood upright on 2 legs. And then Sergej realized something terrifying. It wasn't a bear. It looked more like a gigantic gorilla. Short legs, enormously long arms. But its head was round, not elongated like a gorilla's. and its size was monstrous. Terrified, Sergej pulled the trigger again. At that moment, the creature dropped the limp body of the hunter and disappeared into the fog. The other hunters ran toward the noise. When they turned the victim over, they immediately understood there was nothing they could do. One of his eyes had been blown out by a slug. No one believed Sergej's story about the creature, but the investigation raised disturbing questions. The slug that passed through the victim's head was later found embedded in a tree, more than 4 meters above the ground. That meant that when the fatal shot was fired, the man's head had been at that exact height. The bullet could not have ricocheted that way. The trajectory made no sense. There was also a large amount of blood nearby, not the victim's. Something else had been bleeding. And when the body was examined, investigators found wide bruises on both forearms, as if something enormous had been gripping him. So maybe Sergej wasn't lying after all. But there was no proof of another creature, and Sergej already had a criminal record. So the investigation didn't go any deeper. He was found guilty. After all, it was his bullet that ended a man's life. But one question remained unanswered. Was there really a Yeti in that forest, or something else entirely? When I was told this story, it only confirmed something I had already suspected. Cats are not just intelligent in a strangely human way, they're mystical creatures too. To hear the full story straight from the source, I even asked to be introduced to the main man in it, Grigory. Grigory, like me, was an experienced hunter, but probably even more seasoned and more fanatical about it than I was. If I usually went out for 2 or 3 days, he could disappear into the forest for a week, sometimes for his entire vacation, holed up in one of his hunting cabins. Back in his younger days, Grisha had been married once, but not for long. He and his young wife split up before they'd even made it a year together. So well into his 30s, Grigory was still living with his mother in a huge 3-bedroom apartment in downtown Yekaterinburg. After that first failed marriage, he had no real urge to marry again. And, judging by everything, his mother had no desire to see another woman running the household either. And his mother was not the kind of woman anyone pushed around. She was built like a blacksmith, taller than her son, and had spent her entire life working in a major construction company as a top executive. I knew her myself through work. She was the kind of woman who could freeze a room with one look. She had raised Grisha alone. He barely even remembered his father. Not a single photograph. Just a few old letters he had once stumbled across in his mother's desk as a child. Maybe he never would have married again at all, and would have gone on happily hunting birds and animals, if one day he hadn't fallen for a woman named Alla. I never asked where they met, but Grisha was so taken by her that he invited her to move into his apartment along with her 2 young children from previous marriages, each by a different father. To say his mother wasn't thrilled about the new tenants would be putting it mildly, but despite her pressure, Grigory stood his ground like a stone cliff. A hunter through and through. Once we make up our minds, not even a fearsome mother can knock us off course. The apartment was large enough, and everyone somehow fit in without getting in each other's way. His mother and his new wife even seemed to coexist, more or less peacefully. The only open hostility was between Alla and his mother's beloved old ginger cat, Brick. That was the nickname his mother, being a construction boss, had given him because of the colour of his fur. Alla picked on that dignified old tomcat every chance she got, and Brick hated her right back. He hissed at her like an enemy, and sometimes even bit at her ankle. But with her children, he played happily. Every now and then, Grisha's mother still warned him that he had made the wrong choice. Not because Allah had brought 2 Chuzhik kids into the house, she said, but because Allah herself was a bad woman. A mother's heart can feel these things, she told him. She doesn't love you. But Grisha didn't believe her. He asked his mother to be kinder and more forgiving. Money wasn't a problem anyway. His mother earned more than most men could dream of, and Grisha himself was doing well too. They already had enough savings for a cottage house and a new, larger family car. And before long, the cottage really was purchased. Then, disaster struck. His mother, the woman people at work called the Iron Lady because she had never once taken sick leave, was suddenly rushed straight from a construction site to intensive care in the cardiology ward. A massive heart attack. The best doctors fought for her life. She was a respected and well-known figure in the city, but they couldn't save her. She died on the 2nd or 3rd day. Grigory spent all that time at the hospital, though they wouldn't let him in to see her. Only a few minutes before her death, when the doctor had already given up, was he allowed to say goodbye. Her final words to her son were, "Leave Allah. She'll destroy you." Grief-stricken, Grigory chalked those words up to his mother's bitterness. He didn't take them seriously, and he certainly didn't follow her advice. His mother was buried, and strangely, at the same time, old Brick disappeared too. He had never been let outside. He was a completely indoor cat. Most likely, he slipped out during the chaos surrounding the funeral. So many people had come by to pay their respects that the apartment door had barely been shut for 2 straight days. But at the time, Grigory hardly noticed. He was crushed by grief, though he mourned the cat too. Brick had lived with him and his mother for 17 years. Right after the funeral, Allah wanted to move into the new cottage immediately. Grigory took her and the children there so they could settle in, but he stayed behind in the city apartment. His mother's scent still lingered there. Her things were still where she had left them, familiar and painfully dear. He simply couldn't abandon all of that at once, so he decided to stay there a while longer and join his wife and stepchildren once his mind had settled. To clear his head faster, he took a month off work. About 10 days after the funeral, he headed for his favourite and most remote hunting cabin, deep in the northern Ural forest. Usually he went there with 1 or 2 friends. This time, he chose to go alone. He couldn't bear the thought of forcing smiles or making jokes with cheerful hunters. He stopped by the cottage first, spent the night there, told Allah he'd be gone for 3 days, packed everything he needed, and set off early the next morning. By the time he reached the cabin, evening had already fallen. After hiking 20 kilometers in the summer heat, loaded down with gear, he was exhausted. Once he dropped his pack, he stepped out of the small hunting cabin and onto the riverbank overlooking a fast-moving stream. There he saw a magnificent sunset over a dark, endless forest stretching in every direction. At once, something in his soul felt lighter. There it was, eternal and mighty life itself. How small and pitiful a human being is compared to the grandeur and permanence of nature. In the evening stillness, the songs of the birds were slowly fading. Everything around him was quiet, except for the low murmur of the river. The crushing grief that had weighed on him for days began to loosen its grip. To relax completely, Grisha took a drink of whiskey from his ever-present hunting flask. Then he had a quick bite to eat and lay down to sleep. He woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat. His chest was burning and tightening so badly he could hardly breathe. Fear hit him all at once. He had no strength to fight for his life. He couldn't even move. Every attempt to stand sent a stabbing pain through his heart and a wave of nausea through his body. It kept getting worse. He realized he wouldn't last long. With every fiber of his being, Grigory felt that he was dying. There was no help to be had. There was no cell signal out there. No people for dozens of miles. At some point, he blacked out. When he came to, at first he didn't even know where he was. Darkness. Then he moved slightly, and the piercing pain in his chest brought it all back. The cabin, the forest, the terror of death. To die in your early 30s was bad enough. To die completely alone was unbearable, and he had never had health problems. He didn't smoke, he didn't abuse alcohol, he had no chronic illness. So what had happened? He could taste whiskey and blood in his mouth, unable to move, clinging to life by the last threads of willpower. He thought frantically, "They'll start looking for me in 3 days when I don't come back and Allah raises the alarm. But how am I supposed to last 3 days if I've already got nothing left?" Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw 2 greenish lights near the door. They blinked once or twice, then started moving closer. A moment later, he felt something heavy jump up onto the sleeping platform where he lay. A cat. A huge one. Ginger. Fluffy like a winter fox. Where had it come from? Deep in the forest, many miles from the nearest home. At once he thought of his mother's old cat, Brick. But this one was clearly bigger, shaggier too, and younger by the look of it. Well-groomed, glossy fur, every hair in place. Strange for a stray, especially one from the deep woods. The cat walked confidently along the edge of the platform and carefully stepped onto Grigory's chest, one paw and then the other. Then it lay down across him full length and began to purr loudly. Grigory didn't try to push it away. He didn't have the strength anyway. He just lay there, staring into the cat's eyes. The animal purred and squinted, warming him pleasantly with its soft, vibrating belly. To Grigory's amazement and relief, his fear of death vanished almost at once. That steady purring seemed to say, "You'll be fine. Trust me." He raised a hand and began to stroke the cat. It purred even louder, and slowly, strength began returning to him. An hour later, he even tried to sit up and stand, but a sharp pain speared through his chest again. Grisha collapsed back down, afraid to move, and without realizing it, drifted into sleep. The cat climbed off his chest, curled up beside him, and kept purring. And Grigory woke the next morning. The huge ginger beast was still there beside him, staring with those enormous green eyes as if asking, "Well, how are you now?" His chest still burned, and every movement sent a sharp stab of pain through him. But Grigory understood one thing. He was not going to die. He still couldn't stand, so he spent the entire day lying on the wooden platform. From time to time, the cat disappeared to attend to its mysterious cat business. But it always came back, jumped onto the man's chest, and began to purr again. And each time, Grigory stroked it with gratitude. The second day passed the same way. He relieved himself right where he lay. Only by the evening of the second day was he able to turn a little and go onto the floor instead. He was desperately hungry, and even more desperate for water, but still couldn't get up. On the morning of the third day, when he opened his eyes, the first thing he saw was the cat's face, right next to his own. And in its mouth was a large grayling. The cat dropped the fish onto Grigory's chest, but the grayling was still alive. It twitched, slid off, and began flopping wildly across the floor. The cat immediately jumped down, caught it, and brought it back. Grigory grabbed the fish and began eating greedily. Anyone who's ever tasted grayling knows how tender and nearly boneless the flesh is. The juicy meat eased his thirst a little too. Soon, the ginger cat brought more fish, one after another, laying them on Grigory's bedding. It was obviously a skilled fisherman. Then again, the river there had always been full of fish. There were no people nearby to disturb it. The next day, fighting through the pain, which by then was no longer quite so blinding, Grigory managed to climb off the platform and crawl to his backpack, where he had water and food. Now survival was starting to feel real. Soon Allah would alert emergency services, and this would all end well. But another 5 days passed. No emergency team appeared. Grigory understood nothing. Allah knew exactly where he had gone. In fact, early in their relationship, he had even brought her there once. They had spent 2 wonderful days there, and 2 even more wonderful nights. So what had happened? Maybe something had happened to her. He could think of no other explanation. By the end of the first week after that cursed trip, the hunter had begun to walk a little, though he was still very weak. His head constantly spun. He felt nauseous, and the pain in his chest still hadn't gone away. All this time, the cat stayed close. It kept bringing fish into the cabin, forest mice, and once it even dragged in a hazel grouse, which Grigory roasted and ate with real pleasure. He offered some to the cat, but the animal turned its nose away. Apparently, it preferred raw forest food. Another week passed. By then, the hunter felt more or less ready for the 20-kilometer walk back. For the trip, he took several dried grayling and his hunting knife. He left everything else in the cabin so he could travel faster. When he was leaving, he turned back toward the little cabin. The ginger cat was sitting on the porch, staring after him. Without thinking, Grigory went back, picked the cat up in his arms, and kissed its furry, purring face. "Thank you, brother. I'm alive only because of you. You saved me from certain death." As he drove his old SUV toward the cottage, Grigory felt a growing anxiety. How was Allah doing? She must have been beside herself with worry. Or maybe something had happened to her or the children. He had been gone for more than 2 weeks without a word. That's it, he thought. I'm buying a satellite phone. Never again. At the gate of the cottage, he was surprised to see a brand new red Audi crossover. Exactly the kind Allah had wanted to buy with the money left over after paying for the house. instead of the big family car they had talked about. Leaving his mud-caked SUV beside the shiny new beauty, Grisha ran inside. Alla was in the room at her vanity table doing her makeup. When she saw her husband reflected in the mirror, she dropped her lipstick and froze, her mouth hanging open. Then she jumped up, ran to him, and began babbling. "Grisha, forgive me. The devil tempted me. It was that old woman. She gave me those drops. I didn't mean to." Grigory's mind went blank. What old woman? What drops? And then, a few moments later, a terrible realization pierced his chest, just like that pain in the forest. No, it couldn't be. Alla couldn't have. Why? He had never hidden his flask, and his wife knew perfectly well that he always took it with him. Sobbing, the almost widow confessed that she had gotten a vial from a psychic woman she knew. It contained a substance village healers supposedly used to place what people called a curse on someone. When added to alcohol, those drops created such a vicious mixture that even a healthy man could suffer a massive heart attack. And if qualified medical help wasn't provided immediately, death was almost guaranteed. Worse still, within a few hours the substance dissolved in the victim's blood without leaving a trace. So even if there were an investigation, there would be no grounds to classify the death as suspicious. Whether from remorse or some feeling only she understood, the young woman poured out the full truth. She said she had married him because she was tired of raising 2 children alone. At first, she claimed, she had loved him too. But over time that love faded. He paid too little attention to her. He kept disappearing on his hunting trips, or who knew where, leaving her alone with her cruel mother-in-law. She said she was exhausted by that life, and now wanted a divorce. And if he went to the police, he wouldn't prove anything anyway. So tomorrow, she said, they would go to the registry office, file for divorce, and divide the shared property. Unless he was heartless enough to throw her and the children out of the new cottage. Grigory had never been the type to argue with women, let alone raise a hand against one. His mother had raised him differently. He was so stunned by the poisonous treachery of the woman he had loved so deeply that he couldn't find words. He simply drove away to his old apartment and spent the night there. Despite his exhaustion from everything he had been through, he did not sleep at all. But by morning, he had made up his mind. Yes, he would divorce her and erase her forever from his life and memory. The next morning, he returned to the cottage and waited outside without going in. At that time, Alla's children were playing near the red Audi, whispering to each other with secretive little smiles. Grigory had always treated both children, a brother and sister, very well, and they were fond of him too. They never called him Dad, but they loved playing with him, asking him for help with homework, and eagerly helping him whenever he asked. A little later, Alla came out, dressed and made up as if for a celebration. She shooed the children back inside and called to Grigory. Giving her unshaven, exhausted husband a dismissive look, then glancing at his mud-splattered SUV, she said, "You don't need to embarrass yourself driving that wreck. Get in mine. I'll drive you one last time." Grigory didn't argue. He got into the passenger seat. The new car smelled of fresh upholstery and Alla's sharp perfume. All of it had been bought with his money, of course, but at that point, he didn't care. He only wanted it to end. They drove off. Alla had completely recovered from her remorse the day before. She looked fresh, even cheerful. She drove the nimble crossover with flashy confidence, almost showing off in front of the husband who had suddenly become so unimpressive to her. And not her husband for much longer. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Grigory noticed something small and fluffy shoot out from under the driver's seat and straight into the pedals beneath Alla's feet. At that exact moment, a shrill scream rang out. First feline, then human. Instead of the brake pedal, Alla had stepped on a tiny ginger kitten that had somehow gotten into the car. Startled out of her mind, she let go of the steering wheel and jerked both feet up in terror. The Audi shot into the oncoming lane at full speed. As if in slow motion, Grigory saw a huge truck barreling toward them, horn blaring. Acting on instinct, the experienced hunter yanked the passenger door handle and threw himself out. The monstrous impact struck the front left side of the brand new crossover, hurling Grigory, who hadn't fully made it out yet, far into the roadside ditch, into soft grass and black soil. He jumped to his feet immediately and ran toward what remained of the Audi, which had been thrown dozens of meters from the point of impact. People from the cars that had stopped were running there too. Alla was dead. In a collision like that, there had been almost no chance. And if Grigory hadn't managed to fling himself through the open door, he would have died too. People stood around the wrecked pile of red metal, now red with blood too, not daring to come closer and see a sight that would haunt them for years. Only Grisha stepped close first. And then he heard a pitiful little meow. On the floor, tucked into the far corner of the crushed interior, sat a tiny ginger kitten with huge, terrified eyes, claws dug desperately into the carpet, meowing. Grisha pulled the little thing free, practically peeling it off the floor, and tucked it against his chest. Later, it turned out the kitten had been put there by Alla's children. They had found it that morning by the gate of the cottage. First, they played with it in the yard. Then, when their mother came outside, they hid it inside the car so she wouldn't see it, scold them, and force them to throw it back out. Alla had never liked animals in the house, and cats least of all. Ever since meeting the independent old brick, she had hated them on sight. The kitten must have hidden under the seat at first, then decided to dart out, just at the worst possible moment. Grigory did not send his late wife's children to an orphanage, and he did not take them to live with her alcoholic parents in the village. He decided he would raise them himself. That was how fate had turned. He had already started teaching the boy about hunting. And of course, they kept the poor little ginger kitten too. They had all been living together for nearly 3 years by then. As for what came next, life would decide.